Welcome to another episode of the Plutus Awards Podcast. Our community is filled with hundreds of stories from creators and entrepreneurs just like you. And through this show, we share these stories of challenges and successes from bloggers to podcasters, from writers, speakers, and more. I'm your host, Michelle Jackson. Today's guests are Julien and Kiersten Saunders of Rich and Regular. We talk about the importance of knowing how to talk to your audience versus at your audience, how they decided on a monetization strategy that allowed them to stay out of the pockets of the community that they serve with their content, and the goals that they have for their upcoming book. I can't wait for you to hear this conversation. Hey, Julien and Kiersten, could you do me a favor and introduce who you are and what you do?
Hi, everyone. I'm Kiersten. This is my husband, Julien, and we are the co-creators of richandregular.com, as well as the co-authors of Cashing Out, Win the Wealth Game by Walking Away, which is our new book. Super excited to be here and talk about all things blog and book and brand and money.
How did you even get into the personal finance space? I'm curious about that, especially for the people who aren't familiar with who you are and what you do.
Yeah, it started with just being an enthusiast, being a reader of other people's blogs and a viewer of other people's video content. We were just kind of intrigued by this world. In fact, I remember very clearly, seeing you and say, who was that girl on the PBS series, things that we were watching years ago with Pete, Mr. Money Mustache. But it started with us watching content, being intrigued by it, trying to share it, and realizing that very few of the people that we knew could care. they just were not interested at all. And that was just a very interesting moment for us. It was like, well, what is it? What don't they get? And we just realized that they just didn't really see themselves in it. And so that's really when we started to put two and two together as a trained marketer. And even with Kiersten, with her background in business development, we were saying, actually, this is a really intriguing marketing problem. How do we make this message that we know is applicable to all people resonate with very particular audiences? And so we started leaning into our skill sets and our creative skill sets around storytelling and our understanding and love for community and culture. And all of that just became Rich and Regular, the blog, and we've branched out ever since then.
Could you do me a favor and really expand on what you do as content creators? I love what you do, in particular, your video content. Could you talk about the development of that content and why you decided to lean into video in the way that you did?
Yeah, so I'll start with the latter part of the question, why we decided to lean into video, because we didn't start there. We started with our blog, and we would do a little bit of video content, but I mean, very, very little. So one, it was that we realized and started thinking about, like, what would it take to make these, again, going back to the initial ideas, like, what does it take to make this message resonate with people? And I was like, oh, it can't look like financial content. And I remember days where we would just be at home, working from home, or even just days where you would have company over and you would just have television on. And it was like, wow. So even if we're not watching food TV, you may just actually have it on in the background, or even if it's just like sports, you may just have it on, but you'll have it on mute. And we started really thinking, like, wow, like, how much more people could we reach if we tried to reach them and designed our content in a way where it was so compelling that it was, what's the word I'm looking for? It was entertaining. We just realized that being entertaining was a very, very powerful thing, which meant that we needed to actually learn more from the people who created entertainment content than the people who created personal finance content. And so we also decided to lean into which feels like it was a former lifetime ago, but my background in culinary arts and cooking. And so I said, you know what, if I were to do a money show, it would probably be a combination of a money show and a food and travel show. And so that was really the genesis of it all. We were like, yeah, let's do it. Let's blend it together. We honestly probably spent a couple of years thinking about it before we ever decided to create anything, and found a videographer, decided to pay him some money, and came up with the concept, told him what we were looking for. And ever since then, it's just been a really great collaborative process.
One of the things that I find interesting about the personal finance space and the content that's being created is, we're talking about a lot of the same concepts. And I feel oftentimes like it's gotten so dry. And I don't understand why personal finance is so dry when it's so like money and power. It's like a sexy topic. Why do you think people are leery about leaning into a lot of the sexiness that is personal finance and just staying really on the surface, which with content like what's budgeting instead of how does a madam budget for her business? Or like there's so many things we could talk about.
I know.
And people just don't do it. And I get so frustrated. What do you think is behind that?
I think it's actually a good intention and a fundamental misunderstanding about humans and the human condition. I think a lot of us believe that people aren't doing it because they don't know how. And so the only job that you can fill, the only role that you can fill in their life is to be their instructor, to be their teacher, to tell them, here's the difference between a Roth IRA and a traditional, or here's how I set up my savings account and automate it. But what we know to be true is that people learn through stories, people learn through peer groups, people establish what's valuable and meaningful and popular through what their friends are doing. And so you should actually be trying not necessarily to be an educator in their life, but to be a role model in their life, to show more of how you use your money, to reveal more about the conflicts that you have internal and interpersonally, and just start to talk about what money looks like in real life, not just in theory, but in practice. And the way for us that was most effective to highlight that was through video so that people could see all of the communication forms when it comes to money. It's not just the math part. It's who gets the bill at the end of a meal, or what kind of face somebody makes when you mention savings, or how their voice modulates when they're talking about work. Mm-hmm. It's all of these little things that actually communicate more than what we think. And that's hard to do if you're just writing and kind of placating to SEO and algorithms. I think that's why a lot of people don't do it, is because one, it's much harder for an algorithm, which is basically just a computer, to pick up on that nuance. And so you don't necessarily get all the likes and the follows, but you do get the hearts and minds of the people who actually find the message.
I would add to that, and I'll try to be brief here, but I think most finance professionals, most financial educators just simply aren't creative, and they don't see themselves as creative.
It's that part. They are creative, but they don't see themselves as creative.
And they don't see themselves as such. And so I think that's a part of it. And then secondly, I would say a lot of them simply aren't trained in the discipline of marketing. And so they don't really understand how to do it. And so it's not necessarily their fault. They're very much trained to believe that the content that they should be creating is based or rooted in this idea that people are financially illiterate, and therefore I need to teach. It needs to be how to. And I've always thought, why needs to happen before we even get to how to. Someone needs to care. Like, why should they care? And so let's talk about those things. And then after you've piqued their interest, then you can introduce and say, all right, well, then here's how to do it.
But there are a lot of people who are in the personal finance space who kind of became quote unquote influencers. So for those people, they're not necessarily trained to be in this space. They've decided to be a part of the space and share their journey. And so why do you think they fall in the habit of creating content that is teaching versus showing? I love the point that you made in your previous comments, but for those people who just landed in it, what do you think is going on? Because when I first started being in the personal finance space, everything was really story driven. Like in the written form, when people were blogging, they were always sharing their story, and then something happened. What do you think kind of happened for it to evolve in the way that it has? I do think it is leaning back to story, though.
I think there was a wave of courses and coaches who suggested that blogging should be a passive activity and taught people how to automate everything and batch content and produce a ton of content in a short amount of time. And that kind of became like the gold star for a lot of people. And what you lose in that process is the ability to create original content, to think and consume and connect ideas. That stuff takes time, and it takes labor, and it takes frustration as you're trying to figure out how you want to tackle something. It's almost like we lost this admiration for the artist and for the artistry of the craft. And so I agree with you. I do see us kind of swinging back towards the middle and becoming more story driven as it's harder to make traction with just definitions. But I think it was just a sweeping wave of courses and marketing that all came at the same time that suggested that story driven actually wasn't the way to go, and that you could make more money or gain more notoriety or fame or whatever the goal is through another means.
Is blogging dead?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think it's evolved. There's still a ton of content that is consumed, a ton of written content that is consumed on a daily basis. But I think in the writing space, there's been all of these verticals that have been created where freelancers, there's writers who don't consider themselves to be freelancers. There are freelancers who don't consider themselves to be content creators. There are content creators who don't consider themselves to be influencers. And there are all these like kind of splitting hairs identity where then you lose track of the idea that writing is still very much the way that we communicate online. And so the idea of blogging being dead is silly because it might be in the form of a newsletter. They might call it a newsletter these days, but the majority of content online is still written, with video coming very, very close behind it with the emergence of TikTok and some of these social networks that are video only.
The tension between monetizing a personal finance brand and serving community is really the question that we're talking about in this season of the Plutus Awards podcast. So did you guys find that you had some concerns, or did you address some issues around monetization before starting to monetize? Or were you worried that if you monetize that this would turn off your community? And what did that discussion look like, especially because you're a couple? So did each of you have like a different concern, or were there any concerns at all? I'd love to hear what happened in that conversation.
They were definitely concerns. And before I even get into those, I would just say I think it's awesome that you guys are covering this topic because it's such a, I think, really interesting and important one that I think a lot of content creators need to have. But we are human beings, and we certainly understood the financial implications of monetizing our audience very early on. But as we started doing it, we also were paying attention to like what it felt like and whether or not, if we were to become successful, who we would become and whether or not we wanted to be those people. And that's when we realized that, actually, like there's a way to do this where you can still make a lot of money, but not do it in ways that you don't necessarily feel good about. And I think that was especially important for us because our audience is African Americans. And unfortunately, a significant percentage of them don't really have a lot of money to give. And so for me, I didn't want to be an additional item, on their budget, right? Or on their credit card statement or checking account statements. I'll also say this, I will never forget, I think it was 2017, our first FinCon. We were listening to a keynote speaker, and one of his talking points was something to the effect of, if you see $1 on the ground, pick it up. And his point was that, there's a lot of money out there. Like, doesn't matter if it's $1, if it's $5, if it's a penny, pick it up. And I just remember thinking like, yeah, but what do you look like if you just, imagine you're the guy that's just running around picking up pennies, every single penny. Like if you're that person, like what do you look like to the community that you're leading? And by the way, your back probably hurts. And so I was just saying, you know what, I feel like there's a better way to do this. And it kind of worked out for us because we're far more comfortable, one, asking a financial institution or brand for a much bigger paycheck than trying to collect that, let's say, $10, $20, or even $100 at a time from the people that we're actually serving or from the community that we're actually serving, because the nature of that relationship changes. The moment you start taking money from them, like you're also serving them. And we didn't really want that, right? Like I don't want to lead a community of people that are asking me questions every single day because that's not who we are. That's not what we want to do. There's certainly people who do that and they do it well, but we weren't really interested in that. We were far more interested in creating really, really rich, creative, compelling content and using that as a lever to attract brands. And so far it's worked.
Actually, could you expand on that? I've had a couple of other guests who approach monetization in really unique ways. And I think hearing you guys say, look, we have a community that we're working with. We don't want to ask them for the money, but there's other people with deep pockets who can help us sustain our brand, grow it, and provide the content that we're creating for our community. What did it look like in terms of reaching out to these brands and saying, this is a worthwhile community to share your brand with, and we're going to create something that's going to resonate with them? Like, could you just share a little more? And do you guys also do affiliate marketing in addition to brand collaborations? I'm assuming also speaking engagements and so on. So could you kind of share what that monetization looks like? Because I think that would be really interesting for the audience.
Sure. So for us, it was really about building a brand. Rich and Regular is a brand. It is something that we believe owns a tiny place in the hearts, in the minds of our community. And so the benefit of doing that and taking the time to create that brand, which in large part came with us telling our own story, being very transparent about the things that we're doing well, the things that we're learning, the way that we're thinking about things, and just helping other people to say, wow, I feel the same way, but I had never thought about it that way, or I couldn't really describe it that way. And so we basically used all of our skills to help build that kind of intimate community. The benefit of doing that is, and I want to be mindful of my word choice here. You said, what does that process look like, or reaching out to brands? The benefit of doing that is that in many cases, you don't have to reach out to brands. They reach out to you, because if they're trying to accomplish their objectives, they realize that, hey, at the end of the day, these people have their attention, right? And so if you want to get their attention, you kind of have to go through us. And so while it's a brand, from a business perspective, we also think of it as a lighthouse or as a door. If you want to get the attention of this particular group, it makes sense for you as a brand or whatever it is to work through us, because we know exactly what this audience wants to hear, how they want to hear it, when they want to hear it, what they might be interested in, what it needs to look like, sound like, feel like, more importantly. And that's really where we step in as brand partners, whether you want to call it influencers or whatever it is. But that's where we step in and collaborate with them and say, hey, this is what I would do to promote this program or this product or this service. And here's how much it would cost for us to create that.
I think it also just takes into consideration the life cycle of fintech and financial institutions. So the traditional financial institutions have been around for, 30, 40 years, blue chip stocks. And then there was this newer cohort of fintech companies who initially just needed signups and momentum and users. And so that was a very different piece of content. But in between those two life cycles, in between just being a scrappy startup and a old institution, there's this middle period where you're really trying to win loyalty and heart and share of wallet. And what that requires is very different kind of marketing. It requires stories, use cases, examples, just a very different kind of content. And that's where we play. And so it was also a very strategic choice to know that we're not going to be the first choice of a startup who's looking to make a huge splash. I mean, maybe we will, but I don't mean to take us out the game, but we're not going to be on the top of the list of people at either end of the spectrum in most cases. But when they niche down and they're trying to reach a certain demographic or achieve a certain feeling in their marketing, that's where we play.
Yeah, I have to go back to our business plan, but we very specifically wrote in our business plan before we launched the blog that we were not going to be the biggest. But what we wanted to be was your favorite creator's favorite creator.
We did say that.
Oh, I love it.
That's exactly what
that's like a rapper thing, like your favorite rapper's favorite rapper.
That's exactly what it was. But that's who we wanted to be. We didn't want, because we know how exhausting it is to be the biggest. And it was like, I don't want to be that. I want to be the person that person wishes they could be. Jay-Z says he wishes he could be Common. He wishes he could be Talib Kweli, but those people aren't bringing in nearly as much money as Jay-Z is. But that's
they have a lot more freedom and some.
Yeah, they can still go to Target.
Yeah, absolutely. They get to do the little things that Jay-Z simply can't do. And so that's for us was like, you know what, that sounds a lot more fun than being Jay-Z all the time. So, let's lean into that. Anthony Bourdain was another huge influence. And again, this is why we felt like it was so important to go the route that we did with video content, because he made us travel to places that we had never thought about traveling. It was like, well, that's what I want to do for money. That's what I want to do for financial independence. You might think you would never in a million years ever want to travel to that place. But if you watch an episode of No Reservations or Parts Unknown, and he makes it interesting, it was like, oh, well, I can go for that. And by the time you're there, you're hooked. You're in, you start to realize that it's far more beautiful than you ever thought. And next thing you know, your entire perspective on that idea changes. And so we borrowed a lot creatively, or I would say got creative license from watching a lot of his content and absorbing it in our personal lives.
Those are two of my favorite cooking shows of all time. So
Yeah.
I love to hear that. This is a slightly awkward question, but I think there's some people probably wondering about this. But did you pay for the editing and other aspects of producing your content in the way that you wanted to produce it before generating income in your brand? And what was that decision like between you two in investing? Because you never know what's going to happen. So what did you guys talk about in making a decision around paying for editing and that kind of thing when you launched?
For Rich and Regular or for Money on the Table?
In general, both.
Yeah. So for both of them, we absolutely self-funded, bootstrapped our way through. The first season of Money on the Table, we didn't have any sponsors, I don't think. We were just trying to prove out a proof of concept. And so we didn't have any sponsors, but we learned a lot. The second season, we were able to take the first season's results and get a handful of sponsors, but we still had to use some of our own money and we ultimately broke even. But that's kind of been the storyline of our content. But we're able to do that through using the revenues that we gain from our business to business partnerships, like our brand partnerships and other revenue sources. And so that's really like the benefit of building an income portfolio where it's like, I don't have to make money off of the content itself. I can reinvest the money that I make from the broader business into content, give that away, attract the kind of sponsors that I want. And it becomes this cycle of this being how I reinvest into my business. There are some people who reinvest through staffing. There are other people who reinvest through systems and software. We just happen to reinvest through creating content because we just believe that it has a longer tail.
Yeah. And the thing that I think a lot of creators miss or maybe don't understand about Money on the Table specifically, because I think one of the first things people see is like, oh my gosh, how much money did they spend on this thing? The reality is when you invest to that degree in yourself, brands see that, right? And there's a certain level of respect that they come to you with. Like they know that that you will treat their brand with respect because you treat your own brand with respect. Right. Secondly, you can charge a premium for your services because you know that the quality of what you do is well beyond what most people would create. And you might say, well, you never know what's going to happen or you never know what brands are going to do. But I would say that's true for any case. You never know what's going to happen in any case. But for us, I did know that if we created content that stood out above and beyond everyone else's, whether or not it was the biggest was going to be irrelevant because reality is it was so unique that you couldn't unsee it. It was the type of thing that as a viewer, you were going to see it, you were going to remember it. It's not like I was using a name that you were unfamiliar with. Money on the Table is a familiar statement. So I didn't have to try to get you to remember anything. And so, we knew that in part, it was not just content that our viewers would enjoy, but it was content that brands would be proud to be affiliated with, and we'd be able to charge a premium for it. And so it is part content for viewers, but it's also part commercial to brand partners who are looking for some other way to stand out in a crowded field.
Join Julien Saunders, Janice Torres-Rodriguez, Jason Vitug, and more at the Plutus Impact Summit, a virtual event for financial content creators and influencers on July 22nd and 23rd. See all the sessions and register for free at plutusimpact.com.
So this year you are publishing a book. Could you share how this concept came about and what's your personal goal with your book?
Yeah, so Cashing Out, Win the Wealth Game by Walking Away is really about this acknowledgement that most of us understand that our careers and office politics is a game, but we still play it as if it's a game that we can win. And winning looks like, becoming a VP or just continuing to climb the ladder and hitting the top of any organization. But the reality is that winning actually looks like being able to quit on your own terms and walk away while you're ahead. And so cashing out is kind of laying out the financial framework for you to allow that to happen, for that to be a choice for you. The goal is for people to recognize that they have a choice in the situation. We've been so comfortable with the imbalanced power dynamic between employer and employee for a really long time. And employees often feel like they don't have a choice, but employers can make the choice to furlough, to lay off, to cut hours at any point, reorganize the structure of the company at any point. And so our hope for this book is that we give more people the tools that they need, the resources, the framework, the practices to start to make sure that they always feel like they have a choice. And with that choice, you can choose to stay and continue to make money at a 9-to-5, or you can choose to walk away and pursue other dreams.
The audience for this book, your audience is primarily African American. And I'm curious to know, in the conversations that you're having with your audience, are they receptive to this idea? Or do you find that it depends on generation? Or what is your read so far in how people will react to this concept and idea? Because I'm going to give you a quick story. So the other day I'm talking to my mom, and she very strongly believes that everyone should buy a home. And I've come to the conclusion that that's not necessarily the right decision. And what I said to her was, Mom, people can't even buy gas. They're using Klarna. They are literally Klarna. You can Klarna some gas. Okay. And I'm like, houses in Denver are starting at $600,000. And even if you think people are making money, it doesn't mean that this is a good financial decision. So I share this story to say, I think that there are a lot of people who have these ideas, these really, really, this is the idea about how things should be. How are you reaching folks like that? And some of them are not my mom's age. Some of them are very young, or some of them are Gen X or older millennials. Like, I'm curious about this.
It is a welcomed daily struggle. It is something that we know some people are ready for. So there's some people who have been waiting. And so we know they're going to read this book and they're going to say, oh my gosh, finally, someone had the courage to say it, and they're going to be diehard supporters of it. There are others who are aware of it, who will be mindful of it, but will wait for some type of outward sense of approval before they feel ready to associate themselves with it. It's no different than the launch of an iPhone, right? You're going to have some people who are standing outside and waiting for it, and they want to be the first to have it. And then there's going to be the second wave of people who are like, all right, well, now that it's known to be cool and it's safe to be affiliated with this thing, I'm going to go ahead and dip my toe, or maybe even my entire leg, from feeling frisky in the pool. And then you're going to have those people who actually feel like this is absurd. This is not the way to do it. We should be sticking to our guns and following the tried and true blueprint. And to that, we say, that's fine, go right ahead.
To that, we say, look at the data, right? We have the benefit of timing in that we are publishing this book at a time where there's lots of data that suggests that the traditional rules and paths aren't going to serve this next generation of workers. I was looking at retirement data the other day, and only 18% of retirees retire after 65. 67% of them retire between the ages of 57 and I think like 63 or 64. The majority of retirees are already retiring early. So this is not a foreign concept. I obviously plan to retire earlier than that. But when you are faced with the reality of, I can continue to work and not have any money to save because of the lifestyle that work affords me, or I can retire, not work, and cut back my lifestyle and live off of Social Security and a modest retirement, a lot of people are choosing to do that because they're looking at the path between 57 and 62 when they can draw down Social Security and saying, I can figure something out for the next 4 years, right? That's a choice that's happening right now. We look at the entrepreneurship data. We look at the fact that 97% of Black employees do not want to return to the workplace. We look at the data around wage gaps and equity and diversity in the workplace. And it's like, there's an alarming amount of data that suggests that something is inherently broken at work. And so if you want to bet on work being the stable income in your life for the next 40 or 50 years, to Julian's point, go for it. But somebody should at least give you the opportunity to review the data that suggests that that's probably not going to be the case. After you turn 50, the likelihood that your income is disrupted doubles. So it's just a matter of like giving people the facts that they need to disrupt the narrative that they've heard their entire lives.
How did you decide that this was the book you should write?
That's an incredibly powerful and simple question. I think, at least for me, I've always loved writing. There are people in my life who only know me as a writer. There are some people in my life who only know me as a chef, others who only know me as a marketer, but I have always enjoyed writing. I did not think that the book that I ended up writing would be about this, but it did feel like a bit of a sort of alignment between the stars, the sun and the moon, when, you know, not only were we at a point where we were privileged financially, but the moment that we're in terms of, you know, attention being paid to social causes and really alarming numbers around wealth in terms of our community compared to white communities. And so it just kind of felt like, if I'm going to write a book, it needs to be something like this. That for me was just kind of how I knew. It just kind of felt like, wow, I didn't think it would really be about money. And our book isn't 100% about money. It's really about all of the ways that money shapes and impacts our lives, and hoping that we can get people to think about it a little differently. But yeah, that's mine. I don't know about Kiersten.
I think mine is the same. I knew that we wanted to write a book, a financial book that included the intersection of money and work, because that's such a huge part of achieving any financial goal, is to make sure that you have enough income. And work and wages has been a challenge to that construct. And so we knew we wanted to talk about work, and we knew we wanted to focus specifically on Black professionals, but the book continued to change shape as the world changed. And so as things were happening culturally that made the message more acceptable, we were able to take off some of the hedging that we were doing. There were concepts that 2.5 years ago felt extreme, something like, we have a construct in the book called the 15-year career. That felt extreme to say 2.5 years ago, but now in a world where people understand sabbaticals and leaving places that don't serve them, we've had a couple of conversations about it, and people are like, actually, I think this is what I'm doing. I think based on your formula, I'm on year 11. And it's like, yeah, you probably are. You've been in this space for the last, couple of years. So it's just things like that we were able to be more honest and forthright with the message that kind of helped the book write itself.
I'll add one more thing. And it was really that after having, thousands of conversations about money with people, you just start to learn what works, like what breaks through and what doesn't. And what we really learned was that leading with data and education was not nearly as effective as leaving people with the story that they just couldn't forget. And so that's really when we said, all right, well, this is why writing a book, and also like why creating video content is such a powerful medium, because like people don't forget stories. In fact, so much of what we're trying to get people to unlearn are old stories, right, old beliefs. And so we really said, the creative challenge here, which is why I say the welcomed creative challenge here, is whether or not we believe we could create new stories that resonate with our target audience in the hopes that it replaces the outdated ones and sets them on a new trajectory in terms of saving, investing, and thinking about their careers.
I love that you two are on the cover of your book. And it's really interesting to me that there's this ongoing debate for authors of first or second projects about whether or not they should be on the cover of their book. In fact, for my book, I've decided I'm going to be on the cover. And I would love to hear, why did you decide to do that? And was there a conversation around it, or was it a difficult decision? Like, why are you on the cover of your book? And it looks amazing, by the way.
Thank you. Yeah, there were several conversations, and we went between both because we could see both sides of the argument. ultimately, we asked our audience, and it was really important for them to see us reflected on a book about money. And I mean us like abstractly, not just like Kiersten and Julian's face, but Black people on the cover of a book in the business section is something that's pretty rare. In fact, it's so rare that during the blurb process, so the blurbs and endorsements that you read on the book, we were trying to think of like, who is a Black person in business that could write a quote that is compelling enough to get people to buy a book. And we couldn't think of one. Like we thought of like two, Damon John and like Arlen Hamilton, but there aren't many out there. So that's like part of it. And then our editor, the more that she thought about it, she just realized that a message like this needs a face. It needs something more than just like a graphic that explains what the concept of the book is.
For me, I also think that it leans into your whole point of story-driven content. If you weren't on the cover of your book, I think that would have been a misstep based on all of the content that you've created. I would have missed seeing you on your book.
I think in hindsight, I can't imagine it without our faces on it. Although sometimes that is very convenient because it's hard to see your face that many times on something.
Yeah, it is difficult. I think to Kiersten's point, the most important thing, and I hate to sound like a cold-blooded capitalist here, but if you want to sell the book, then do what you think the people who are likely to buy the book prefer. And so even when we asked our audience, we got a lot of feedback, but then we had to ask, like, yeah, but do we believe that they're actually a book buyer, right? Like you can be a fan of Rich and Regular, and like not everyone if everyone that's a fan of Rich and Regular buys our book, then we're going to be as big as freaking, I can't even think of it, right? That's not going to happen. At least I don't think. But we really had to parse through that feedback and say, all right, but are they buyers? They can be diehard supporters, love us on Instagram, Facebook, and social media, but may not necessarily be the target audience. And we even had to overcome our own fears, right? It was like, all right, man, like I'm pretty sure I'm going to hate that shirt in a year, but now I'm going to have to look at it every single day. I look at, no shade to him, but I look at Ramit's shirt from his book cover and, clothing, like hairstyles, those things get dated very quickly. And so, it's like, all right, but that's a good problem to have. Right. Like I wish somebody would clown my shirt because at least it gets them talking about the book.
Oh, that's funny. So we're wrapping things up and I want to ask a very nosy question. You kind of touched on it in your last comment, which is who's going to buy the book? Do you have a financial goal that you've put in place for the book? Like, how are you going to decide what is considered success for the book? Is it readers coming back and like reaching out to you about the message and the story? Or is it how much you sell? Or is it a combination of the two?
It's a combination for me.
Yeah.
We do have a sales goal in mind that just helps us keep up with the marketing activities and learn whether stuff is working or not. But for me, it was more about one, elevating the crisis that's affecting Black families from a wealth building perspective. Two, making sure that the Black experience at work is a welcome critique among leaders in the absence of George Floyd's murder or any other social justice, movement, just because they're employees and they matter and they contribute in a very meaningful way. And three, it was to welcome people to something they hadn't heard of. The reality is the majority of the world doesn't tweet. They're not on Facebook like that. They certainly aren't on Instagram or TikTok. As much as we think and as loud as those platforms are, the majority of working professionals don't engage with them the same way that the personal finance community does. And so for me, it's about awareness and making sure that they know that this is the thing that exists. Here's how you participate. Here's how you can join and accelerate your financial goals and, just introducing them to a new idea.
I completely agree. No comment.
Right now, the employment market is so frothy that I think it surprises me that there aren't more books like this coming out. What's the read on that? Why do you think that is?
I think it's just the life cycle of publishing. Like It takes 2 to 3 years for a book to go from ideation to shelves everywhere. So you would have had to be pitching this idea like we were 3 years ago. And that would have had to be right after the first round of FIRE books came out. So the, Financial Freedom, Work Optional, Quit Like a Millionaire, all the books that came out. And so a lot of publishers were wary about doing another round because of whatever reason, because they felt like they had exhausted the topic. And because we came at it with a different angle, we got a yes. But a lot of people were wary 2 to 3 years ago because the world looked very different. It was like, okay, that FIRE stuff is cool, but like, no, people want to work forever. And then the pandemic hit. So it's kind of like a Black Swan event where we're writing a book about work culture and personal finance at a time where both things were changing. And I think we had always seen it coming. We didn't think a pandemic was coming, but we had seen the tension, particularly with our friend circle, start to bubble up over the years. And so it was a no-brainer for us.
Yeah.
But convincing traditional media, the powers that be, that this is a thing was far harder than we thought it would be.
What's next? What happens after you publish the book? What's the next goal? Have you thought about that?
Yes. So apparently, as first-time writers, the work doesn't stop. So I've heard, I look forward to speaking. I look forward to helping companies think differently about their efforts around work culture, diversity, equity, and inclusion. I look forward to creating grassroots mini movements, around the country, just like one small town at a time, one little meetup at a time, just kind of planting those seeds and getting people to realize that they have far more power and far more choices than they may have thought prior to reading the book. I look forward to creating content and telling stories on a completely different level. This could be television, could be film, could be short films, but I think there's so much at the intersection of culture and money that I look forward to helping to either tell those stories or elevate those stories being told by other people. Because I really believe we have a shot, and by we, I mean just culturally, a shot at shaping the way that so many people think about work and money right now. But it's going to take some time, and it's going to take a lot of creativity. But we've got a lot of tools at our disposal. It's really just a matter of harnessing our savvy and social capital and financial capital in a way that allows us to get that message out there.
What advice would you give to a person who's a personal finance content creator who may be struggling with where to go next, what to do next? They have these ideas, but they're nervous to lean into them? Because I love how you had this idea for this book that no one wanted to buy into. And then boom, we've got the Great Resignation and COVID and like all this kind of crazy stuff. What would you say to someone who's really fearful to kind of step out there on faith?
I have a lot of advice, but I think my biggest one, which is the one that I use I think about when I'm hesitant to create, is to get rid of the vanity metrics, which is what likes and follows and tags are, and go talk to people in real life. Go try to have the conversation that you want to have online in real life and see how people's faces light up, or see what objections they have, or incorporate the layers of the issue that they bring up. Because I think likes and social media growth is not the best metric to know if your content is resonating. There's some subjects that are extremely meaningful to people, but we don't see the return in terms of like social media or some of these other vanity metrics. So I would just encourage people to like get offline and go talk to people in real life. Go to a meetup.
Go talk to people. If you guys could share where we can find you and buy your book, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, you can find us and our work at richandregular.com. Our book is on pre-sale right now. It'll be on shelves pretty much at every major retailer on June 14th. So Amazon, Target, Walmart, Barnes & Nobles, and a bunch of other stores. It'll be available. Cashing out, win the wealth game by walking away.
Thank you so much for joining me. I am super excited to listen to this episode again. And I wish you all the luck. You know, I'm trying to get you on Netflix every time.
Yeah.
You know.
We appreciate you.
I got you. So I got to see that show.
I love it.